Welcome everyone, I'm the Body Counter, and today I'm bringing you a brand new Red Coast to Broken Oblasts video, following part 2 which covered the French Civil War. In case you haven't seen the video, I'll leave a link to it in the description below. But for today's video, we'll be looking eastwards. More specifically, the Russian Civil War and Operation Cultish, the German intervention against the Russian SFSR. So, Germany. How are you feeling after your victory in France? Germany is over the moon, and morale and faith in the military and the Kaiser has returned. While 1919 saw France surrender to the Central Powers in order to fight the newly formed Socialist State of France, or SSF, war was still ongoing against the British and the remainder of the Entente. But really, the only fighting was really on the Macedonian front, mimicking the phony war of 1939 to 1940 in our timeline, except in 1919 to 1920. With victory inevitable for the Central Powers in the Balkans, Germany's eyes began to look eastwards to the bloody conflict happening in Russia. The White Russian government and associated factions were struggling to defeat the Bolsheviks. While the Whites had seen some success in the Caucasus region, they were now being pushed back in Siberia after their victorious spring offensive of 1919. With the Reds steadily consolidating power in Russia, and Admiral Alexander Kolchak's White Russian forces being routed in Siberia, the Central Powers, primarily Germany, began preparations for an intervention campaign from their newly received territories from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In the treaty, Germany received Russian Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Crimea, the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Livonia and Courland, which is present-day Latvia, and Estonia.
Behold! My stuff.
And with a successful intervention could also mean another land grab and increasing their imperial sphere of influence known as Mittel Europa, such as into the Don Cossack region and the absorption of the Cuban region into Ukraine. However, with the idea of an intervention being pushed by the leaders of Germany... No, not that one. There we go. The two men truly in charge, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, thrust the idea of an intervention to their subordinates and those in the military and government. Such a decision would not be free of political conflict, however, and a split was visible within the Reichstag, Bundestag, and High Command. Many of the conservative and anti-socialist members of the government and High Command viewed the ambitious operation as just and necessary to further increase German dominance in Europe, put the Red Menace to the east to rest, and to decimate the hope of German revolutionaries within their own borders from sparking a revolution against the Empire. However, the more liberal and downright socialist sympathising members of the government barked at their opinions, stating that the operation would entice mutiny in the army, as the prospect of further war would be frowned upon by the people and military, and further emphasised the need to demobilise and restore the empire to pre-war stability. These debates continued from January to April 1919, but with the High Command essentially acting as dictators of the empire, any opposition to their decision was thrown aside, and they would have the final say. By May 1919, initial preparations for the intervention were being fulfilled, but it wouldn't be until August of 1919, just 2 months after France had officially surrendered, that full-scale preparations would be completed, with half of the Western Front forces being moved to the east yet again, with the other half going to Macedonia. Among these reinforcements and the troops already stationed in the nations of Brest-Litovsk, the Ukrainian state and Kingdom of Finland would also partake in the invasion with their newly formed armies, supplied by the Germans and using captured equipment. Propaganda was an important part of the operation, as anti-French and British propaganda was phased out for anti-Bolshevik ones, asking for the men of Germany and Austria-Hungary to fight eastwards once more to rid the socialist threat. Once authority was firmly secured in Ukraine and Finland agreed to partake in the intervention, the Central Powers neared their date. The operation would involve 7 offensives, 2 from Finland and Estonia in an attempt to sever Petrograd from the rest of Red Russia, 1 from Livonia as a diversionary offensive, 1 from the Belarus People's Republic to capture Smolensk, and 3 from the Ukrainian state, 1 aimed in relieving the southern Russian forces of the Caucasus, and 2 striking north towards Voronezh and Kursk to divert Red Army forces away from the White Army. The Germans and the rest of the Central Powers were thankful they didn't have to fight through the Pripyat marshes. August 10th, 1919. Operation Cultish begins with staggering success. The Red Army had formed a curtain force of Soviet detachments along the line of Brest-Litovsk in the likelihood of a German invasion during the Civil War. At first, the curtain forces were lacking enough manpower and artillery to cover the entire front, but by mid-1919, the curtain force had enough men to be given the designation of an army at around 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers. Despite the Soviets anticipating a German attack, it would not be enough to hold off the operation. The diversionary attack from the Baltics worked like a charm and was able to capture a few minor strategic targets. After the false offensive, the advance on Petrograd began and was able to cut off the city from the rest of the Soviet forces in central Russia. In doing this, it made it significantly harder for the Red Army to coordinate from command at Petrograd. As for the offensives launched from Belarus and Ukraine, the German and Belarusian advance was stopped outside the city of Smolensk, and a harsh series of breakthrough attempts was made by the Central Powers to break through the city's defences. It wouldn't take long for the Germans to encircle the city instead of attack it head-on, by breaking through the weaker defences on the city's flanks. From Ukraine, the German advance allowed the White Russian forces to unite the armed forces of South Russia with the All-Russian government headed by Admiral Kolchak, finally creating a unified front line against the Soviets. The offensive north towards Kursk and Voronezh saw some initial success but was slowed by the incoming Red Army reinforcements. The White Russians, while opposed to the German intervention, were reluctantly forced to accept their help, as they rather received their aid and faced defeat at the hands of the Reds.
Oh, look at all the action! Oh, there's so much action! Oh, look at that action! Oh.
This agreement did come at another cost. With the new land connection between the South Russian forces, German intervention armies, and the All-Russian government, came a more turbulent part of the Russian Civil War's political aspect for the White Russians. By late 1919, the anti-Bolshevik factions held a series of conferences from November to late December. Lavrov Kornilov, Anton Denikin, Pyotr Wrangel, Alexander Kolchak, and Nikolai Yudenich of the White Armies, Max Hoffmann and the representatives of Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg from Germany, Pyotr Krasnov of the Don Republic, and a representative of C.G. Mannerheim of Finland, met in Novocherkassk and Omsk to discuss the future of Russia, more specifically, the possibility of a cooperative united front between all major anti-Bolshevik factions, the unification of said factions into one government, and to re-ratify the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, following the demise of the Bolsheviks. An agreement would not be reached until early 1920, but talks would commence nonetheless. Kolchak was adamant on maintaining his position as supreme ruler of Russia and his relations with the now crumbling Entente. Meanwhile, the South Russian armies under Kornilov, Denikin, and Wrangel had already sided with the Central Powers for support ever since the Entente were on the back foot of the Great War. Kolchak would begin to see the reasoning behind accepting German support as the Entente steadily began withdrawing their interest and support in Russia to prioritise their efforts in aiding the French Republic in their civil war. The Entente had already withdrawn out of northern Russia, leaving Yevgeny Miller's army to die in Archangel, and it was mainly the Japanese who were aiding in Siberia, but it was not for supporting the White Russians, but an ulterior motive to secure a buffer state in the Far East against the new Russia that was to form post-Civil War.
Now let's see what we have here.
With mediation from the Germans and a threat to withdraw the intervention forces from Russia, both the Siberian government under Kolchak and the South Russian armies of the Big Three agreed to form a united front under Kolchak's existing all-Russian government. The Big Three, Kolchak and the other anti-Bolshevik leaders, were to now collaborate in their military operations to defeat the Reds, and it was settled that a re-ratification of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would begin after the Civil War had ended. Operation Cultish and the formation of the United Front may have brought the light back to the White Russian hands, but it was not without its existing problems, and new issues were due to arise with the new alliance of governments, and Kolchak still held plans of his own behind the backs of his allies. After the United Front had cut off their relations with the Entente by December 27th of 1919, the still stranded Czechoslovak Legion within Russia, which had helped the White Russians against the Central Powers and Bolsheviks, were now without their biggest ally. This caused a fragmentation in the Legion. Many formations were to continue their journey to Vladivostok in far eastern Russia, while many began to oppose Kolchak for his near traitorous decision to cut ties with the Entente, and some formations very much defected to fight against Kolchak, leading to the coup of January 1st. A large portion of pro-Entente Czechoslovaks marched on Kolchak's headquarters in Omsk, and what was meant to be a bloodless coup turned into a fierce siege within the headquarters. Czechoslovak soldiers and White Army guards fought in the headquarters for over 2 hours, before White Russian reinforcements arrived to surround the building, leading to the surviving legionaries being rounded up and arrested. The coup had failed, but what made the coup more of a hopeless struggle was the fact Kolchak wasn't even in Omsk.
Voy a la playa, había subido la marea.
Kolchak had left hours earlier before the coup to give a speech to White Army troops on the front line, celebrating a new year and a dawn for the true Russia. Nice one, legionaries. Better luck next time? With the failed coup of January 1st came an intensification of the White Terror within the all-Russian government. Socialist revolutionaries were targets for arrest and execution for alleged collaboration against the supreme ruler of Russia and his allies. Jews, socialists, and other potentially dangerous individuals and groups of people were victims of Kolchak's White Terror, much like the Red Terror that swept through the Bolshevik-controlled territories of Russia. Minor offensives would continue between all sides until March of 1920, when the first collaborative White Movement offensive would commence, regaining much of the land lost west of the Ural Mountains last year. Both sides saw heavy losses, and the recently thawed lands of Russia were muddy to all hell following the end of the winter, increasing the difficulty in traversing land fast and pulling supplies to the new front lines. Lasting from March to May, the offensive managed to retake much land, but no clear strategic gains were made besides a few towns, and Moscow was far from harm. In July, the German intervention forces would commence the next grand phase of Cultish. After waiting out the snow and the thaw of winter and spring, the Germans would initiate 2 major thrusts into the Soviets, one into Petrograd and the other to Moscow. The Battle of Petrograd was almost as devastating as the Siege of Leningrad was in our timeline, at least no one resorted to cannibalism, that is. Finnish and German infantry and German tanks were able to breach the outer defences of the city in less than an hour, and soon the urban warfare would commence. Red Army forces and civilians were soon to run out of weapons and supplies against the better equipped German stormtroopers and Finnish Jaegers. Despite the Central Powers' imminent victory in Petrograd, the Red Army and their massed civilians didn't go down without a fight, committing to ambush tactics and improvised traps, all while being surrounded. What looked like a historical recreation of the movie Home Alone, the Bolsheviks allowed many Central Powers troops into unoccupied territory, only to detonate explosives close to patrols, ignite fuel spills underneath German tanks, and heave flimsy brick walls on top of unsuspecting soldiers.
Hello.
A month-long sweep of Petrograd put an end to the resistance, with no sign of Lenin or Trotsky anywhere, Russia's most wanted. Unknowing to the Central Powers, both were evacuated in January of 1920 across the frozen Lake Ladoga to Moscow. As for the offensive to Moscow, the Red Army was spared a real fight due to the resurgence of the anarchists in Ukraine against the Hetman government. Led by Nestor Makhno, the anarchist Black Army took to combating the Ukrainians and Germans much like they did in our timeline's civil war, utilizing guerrilla tactics and highly effective cavalry units, many using tachankas to beat the less disciplined Ukrainian forces. After seeing much success, the anarchists would not stop until the dictatorship was put to an end, meaning the Germans were forced to shift their focus away from Moscow and back onto their possession of Ukraine. In reality, this disaster for the Germans was good for the coalition of White Army leaders, as it meant Moscow could be won by the Whites. Such a victory would mean an end to the Civil War, more legitimacy for the Whites, and a less impactful re-ratification of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. With the downfall of Petrograd and the Germans held up fighting the anarchists in Ukraine, the Big Three, four now, would begin to formulate the plan for the final victory against the Bolsheviks from as early as May to coast off the success of the Central Powers during the summer. However, unlike the last White Army offensive, this one had much more thought into planning. The objective was to break to the Volga River west of the Urals, crossing said river, causing chaos amongst the Red Army in order to reach Moscow before the Germans. A feat which was now achievable with the boosted morale of the recent territorial gains, and uniting of the White Army fronts into one. The manpower of the White Army along the United Front also began to match the Red Army size, and with the Bolsheviks now having lost Petrograd and the fronts faltering, with desertions becoming more common and morale plummeting following the German invasion, the time to strike for Moscow was fast approaching. The 26th of July, the final offensive to Moscow would begin. Denikin, Wrangel, and Kornilov would strike northwards from Tsaritsyn along both sides of the Volga River, capturing Saratov in August while also launching diversionary attacks towards Tambov and Lipetsk. Seeing this offensive as more of a diversionary attack for an upcoming offensive elsewhere, Soviet forces and reserves were pulled from the Western Russian front and garrison duties to reinforce Kolchak's future offensive path from Samara all the way up north to Archangel, a front that would have been more manageable had the Soviets abandoned Archangel to a position closer to Moscow as to not leave the front too extended. But the Soviets weren't going to give an inch of land to the Whites or Germans without a tussle. The Soviets were not fooled by the diversionary attacks aimed northwest from Saratov, and the reinforcements sent to Kolchak's section of the front could have meant a failed offensive. But a new moment arose for the Big Four, which was quite possibly the most fortunate and coincidentally well-timed moment for the White armies.
Your savior is here!
Alexander Antonov, frustrated with the treatment of the civilian populace at the hands of the Bolsheviks, had left the Socialist Revolutionary Party and was able to muster an armed force of around 20,000 men and women in the regions of Tambov, Penza, Voronezh, and Ryazan, vital regions that were dangerously close to the capital of Moscow. This Green Army, known as the Tambov Rebellion, took up arms against the Reds. Intense fighting took place within the rebellion hotspots before the regions were secured by Antonov's forces. It didn't take long for the Big Four to notice the vital opening they had in their quest for victory, and decided to act upon it. Kolchak advanced along the entire front, able to encircle the Samara Bend Peninsula, putting the defenders under a 2-week-long siege. Kazan proved to be a vital connection along the Volga, and the Soviets held their ground for many days. It wasn't until they were about to be encircled that they were forced to withdraw. The Red Army forces within Kazan fled the siege city while sabotaging the bridge crossing the river. Pushing deep into the Volga, northwestern and central Russian regions, the armies of Kornilov, Denikin, Wrangel and Kolchak converged towards the capital of Moscow. Whilst advancing onwards, the White armies attempted to communicate with Antonov of the Tambov Rebellion to pursue some form of understanding and mutual pact to rid the Soviets. The problem was, the Green armies were formed for a reason. They didn't affiliate with either side, the Reds or the Whites. The Reds oppressed the peasants, and the Whites and pro-monarchists weren't much of an improvement in their rise either. In this trying time, however, a compromise was reached between the Tambov Rebellion and most of the White Army forces. Kornilov and Denikin were more accepting of a possible alliance, while Kolchak, Wrangel, and Antonov were strongly against such a thing. It was agreed that there would be a ceasefire between the Tambov Rebellion and the White Army until an agreement would be reached between both sides. In the meantime, the White armies would continue to storm towards Moscow, and the Tambov Rebellion would continue to disrupt Soviet troops, communications, and execute any proven or suspected socialists. With the opportunity, the White forces managed to capture some 80,000 Red Army soldiers in a pocket against the Tambov Rebellion's territory, and another smaller pocket of 23,000. With the major rivers crossed, the road to Moscow lay open, so open that many bold cavalry units would undergo charges deep into Red Army front lines, with many Cossacks catching many fleeing Bolshevik forces unprepared. These ambushed formations would either surrender willingly to the bold cavalrymen or die fighting. The latter option would almost always be a suicidal attempt. By October of 1920, the anarchists in Ukraine had all but been crushed by the Germans. Nestor Makhno would attempt to escape Ukraine and make his way through Romania into Bulgaria for Constantinople in Turkey. From there, he could find a new future. Oh, no! Unlucky for Makhno and friends, a Ukrainian Austro-Hungarian unit on their way to relieve a German unit recognized the anarchists. The soldiers arrested and disarmed them and returned them back to Kiev for detainment. Once the anarchists in Ukraine and a few pockets of Bolsheviks behind the German front lines were dealt with, the German drive into Russia could continue. November came and Moscow was reached by the White Army, with the Germans lagging behind from the opposite side. The Bolsheviks were surrounded, with food almost completely gone, supplies dwindling and the army demoralized. The days of the Bolsheviks were numbered. The western districts were cut off from the rest of Moscow by assault teams under Kornilov and cavalry under Kolchak. British landships received early in the Civil War proved instrumental in the Battle of Moscow, allowing a single tank to clear a street with infantry following the tank's lead. Improvised defences proved problematic for the White Army forces, either having to go around them and risk being ambushed, or await tank or armoured car support. Prior to the Battle of Moscow, the Soviets had sabotaged the railroads leading into the city, meaning the White Army's armoured trains could not be used in the battle, and supplies had to be transported off train and by car, truck or horse to the front line. The only upside for the Soviets at this point was living on borrowed time and only delaying the inevitable.
You see, the new world is inevitable.
It's what?
Inevitable.
One more time?
Inevitable! Things are inevitably going to change!
Despite the Soviet government having been moved from Petrograd to Moscow in 1918, many Soviet leaders and Red Army commanders made frequent trips between the two cities. But with Petrograd lost to the Germans, said leaders and commanders, including both Lenin and Trotsky, were now trapped in the city with the Whites, Greens, and Germans converging from all sides. The only way out of Russia for the Soviets was the October Railway, which stretched from Moscow to Murmansk. Despite several attempts by the Finnish to take over sections of the railway and Murmansk itself, the line out of Russia remained intact, and with it, many of the highly valued leaders of the Soviet Union began evacuating to Murmansk into exile. Lenin, Trotsky, Dzerzhinsky, Kalinin, Stalin and his family, and many other important Russian names began the days-long journey to Murmansk, while many lesser leaders in power either chose to stay or were ordered to remain to contain the situation. Lasting a little over 3 weeks, the Battle of Moscow would come to an end, and with the siege of the Kremlin came the official capitulation of all Soviet forces, under Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Mikhail Frunze, being two of the highest leading Red Army commanders at the time of the Civil War. They folded, and made the ultimate sacrifice to stay in Moscow to aid in the evacuation of the important Soviet leaders. 3 weeks of fighting came to an end, and the leaders of the White Armies walked into the war-torn Kremlin to discuss the very future of Russia, whilst mopping up any and all resistance that still remained, such as the Tambov Rebellion and other defiant factions. The Soviets had fallen, Lenin and friends had fled Russia to the neutral countries throughout World War I, and now came the rebuilding of Russia and the consolidation of power. All Soviet POWs were captured in the encirclement of Moscow, and military forces were now being relocated to the Tambov Rebellion in anticipation for continued conflict. Denikin and Mikhail Dieterichs headed the armies surrounding the rebellion and were to pose as an intimidation force to sway the Tambov rebels away from looking for another fight. The intimidation was successful to an extent, as desertions from the regions became more common, as Green Army peasants gave themselves up and the civilians within the territory fled to the winner of the Civil War. Still at 50,000 strong, negotiations between Antonov and the White Armies was to resume so a peaceful resolution could be reached. What seemed like weeks of bickering between the militaristic Whites and the rebellious Greens continued. The Whites did not trust the rebels to be reincorporated into the new Russia, and the Greens made outrageous demands for the new government to implement, being political equality, freedom of speech and press, a re-implementation of the socialization of property, and many more points. Negotiations broke down in February of 1921, as the Whites refused to approve such demands. February 15th saw the continuation of the White and Green conflict, technically meaning a civil war was back on. However, the Greens were severely outnumbered, and the Whites would crush the rebellion by early April. Not before several smaller pockets of peasant uprisings sprung up throughout Siberia, including the Far East and the Volga region. Many splinter formations of Bolsheviks and left SRs, that's socialist revolutionaries, sprung up as well, in a hopeless attempt to resume their campaign to rid Russia of the dictatorship at the helm. The complete suppression of the pockets of rebels would not come to be until September of 1921, and the White Terror would continue to suppress the opposing factions and ideologies for another year and a half, killing hundreds of thousands. Beatings, rape, and torture were widespread during the White Terror. So, Russia had finally seen the end of the Civil War by September 1921, and the re-ratification of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be conducted and put in place for the White Russian rulers, now that Soviet Russia was no more. Everything is fine now, right?
Wrong!
This would not be the final threat to Russia, not by a long shot. But for now, the eradication of the Bolshevik ideals and restoration of the nation was to be completed. I hope you enjoyed my coverage of Russia's Civil War and the German intervention. Originally the video was to be much shorter, but I felt the need to discuss a few extra points of interest, lest I leave you guys in the dark as to how exactly victory was accomplished by the Whites. and the Germans. If you liked the video, feel free to drop a like to show your support, and I'll leave a link to my Discord in the description below, as it's another source for RCBO discussion. Subscribe to keep up to date on my next upload, whenever the fuck that'll be. And as always, keep on fighting.